Are we ready? Hi, this is Valerie Leonard, founder of nonprofit Utopia. I am here live at the Hope Cafe in Chicago on the west side, and we are also with Bonnie McEwen. Bonnie is Barrel House Bonnie. She's also a consultant and a blues performer here in Chicago, resident expert. Hi, Bonnie. Hi, everyone else.
Hi, everybody. And I'm really excited to interview Miss Valerie Leonard, who is truly one of my sheroes in Chicago, having discovered a whole lot of things to do with our TIF funding in this town.
Oh, there's a lot going on with our TIFs, that's for sure, that's for sure. Okay, so Bonnie, what can I do for you today? What do you want to talk about?
Well, I think the people want to know, what are you doing with this nonprofit Utopia? Why is it Utopia, and what is your purpose?
Okay, so let's step back a bit. I am someone who's very actively involved in Chicago, doing community organizing around a number of issues. I've also worked with nonprofits. I'm a consultant to nonprofits. And in my experience, not everything works perfectly. One, we're working in the backdrop of Chicago politics, in things known as the Chicago Way, and unfortunately our nonprofits are not exempt from the Chicago Way at all times. Also, the fact that, there are a number of nonprofits who need a lot of help, and I think about how life was when I got started, right? So all of my personal experiences running a nonprofit, as well as being a very engaged citizen who has run up against the Chicago machine, so to speak, I think of what could happen in a perfect world. There's no such thing as perfection, but if there was a such thing as perfection, what would that look like? So I came up with the name Nonprofit Utopia to try to come up with the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders. So, like I said, given some of the experiences I've had, some of which are positive, most of which are positive, some of which are negative, looking at some of the mistakes that I've made along the way, and then trying to help others avoid the same mistakes, trying to make sure that young professionals do things the right way is top of mind. And then also, given the fact that for the first time in over, 60 years now, the baby boomers are no longer in the majority in the workforce. We are retiring. I'm at the very, very tail end of the baby boom age, and I think I've learned a lot. I've had a lot of tough lessons I'd love to share with our millennials, who are now the majority. They are our emerging leaders. And if I and others like yourself, you're also a member of Nonprofit Utopia, could share some of the lessons we've learned the hard way so they don't have to make the same mistakes, that would be an awesome thing. So that's how Nonprofit Utopia came about.
So what are some of the mistakes that you're going to help people prevent?
Okay, one of the top mistakes, it seems, no matter what I'm doing with nonprofit organizations, it could be board development, it could be strategic planning, it could be proposal writing, all roads lead to compliance. And one of the mistakes that I would love to help people avoid is making sure they are in compliance with their IRS filings. So that's not a mistake per se to be in compliance, but the mistake itself is to not be in compliance. We have over 20% of our 1.4 million agencies around the United States who are losing tax-exempt status just for something as simple as not filing Form 990 on time for 3 years in a row. So there are a number of other issues around nonprofit compliance, such as not filing payroll taxes in time, other issues not filing with the Attorney General's office on time or at all. If you haven't registered with the Attorney General's office and you start raising funds, you are really doing so illegally. But many organizations don't know that kind of stuff. So just little simple things like that to help people avoid trouble. That's one of my main focuses, nonprofit compliance.
Do you want to tell any stories? You don't have to mention names, but just what can happen if you don't be mindful of these very, well, at times burdensome and at times nuisance creating requirements?
Right. It's very serious. For example, one of the most egregious cases of which I'm aware, there's an economic development agency that's getting federal funds. They've made loans to their board president, but no loans to the community. That relationship in and of itself is questionable. If they were a foundation, the IRS might consider that self-dealing. But since they're not a foundation, that would be considered conflict of interest, right? And that's still not a good thing. Another instance is where the people who are running the organization are enriched. They're enriching themselves while the organization suffers. The same organization has 2 of its 3 founding board members who are getting salaries, and the organization itself is losing money. That in and of itself doesn't look so good. If you are a board member, it is your first and foremost fiduciary responsibility to put your own interests, put that at bay in favor of the nonprofits. So if you are a board member, you're taking a salary from an organization that's losing money, that's really not necessarily in the best interest of the organization. You're not really subordinating your interest in favor of the organization. So things like that are they're more common than one would think. And that's really, that's one of the other reasons why nonprofit organizations tend to lose their status, to have several instances of conflict of interest, or having it look like the officers or board members are actually enriching themselves at the expense of the organization.
And on Form 990, they ask you those kinds of questions, don't they?
They do.
I've seen these, and they're very strict, and that's one reason I myself have not gotten together a nonprofit, because I can't meet these requirements. So I remain an independent, so-called profit-making contractor for the very reasons that I understand the complexity of this, and I think some people get into it. We know nonprofits are businesses. We have to be business-like, but we can't be in business just to enrich ourselves. Is that right?
Oh, that's exactly right. In exchange for getting your tax-exempt status, you have to agree to serve a charitable purpose. And, the IRS is very, very clear about what those purposes might be. And if you do anything that is not within those guidelines, then you forfeit your ability to get tax exemption.
What are some of the purposes that are a nonprofit, legitimately nonprofit?
Okay, they're usually things like education. That's one of the top ones. Education, charitable purposes, and they usually use a catch-all phrase to encompass anything that is within the community itself. Now, what distinguishes a nonprofit from a for-profit in terms of what they're looking for, you as a nonprofit organization cannot have any profit that would inure to the benefit of the board members, whereas a for-profit, you can actually get profit distribution. So that's one of the differences. And if you are caught as a nonprofit taking some profit beyond your salary, or even taking an excessive salary given your budget, that could raise your red flag. Another thing that would distinguish a charitable organization versus a for-profit is the fact that when you distribute your assets, if in the event that you go out of business, you have to distribute the assets back to the community. And usually that's through another nonprofit organization. So those are the kinds of things. And then if you were going to incorporate in the state of Illinois, there's a whole list of charitable purposes like scientific, education, there's charity, and I can't remember. There are about 13 different purposes that are allowable, but of those 13 purposes, only one within the state of Illinois is not allowable by the federal government, and that is Elio Seminary. Whatever that word, that's an old English word, and so that one is not allowable. That is some derivative of charity, but for some reason that's not allowed. So you have to be very careful when you're setting up your organization. The purposes that are allowed at the state level are not necessarily allowed at the federal level, and you need to make sure that you use the language that the IRS provides for you with and say that you're within that code. And I'm sorry, that's all technical stuff. That's probably not what you really want to teach.
But this is the kind of stuff that Valerie can help you with, right? Because I don't want to know all this stuff either. So, but it can save you a lot of trouble if you have somebody to advise you that does know it. Mm-hmm. And how did you learn all this stuff, Valerie?
I learned it from the best in the business. I actually ran an organization that spun off from a family foundation, and we were very fortunate. Now, I will say that my experience is not typical. Most people who start nonprofit organizations are doing it by hook or by crook and just trying to figure things out. We were provided with the best attorney in the business. He actually helps to write the state code. And I watched very carefully as we were spinning off our department into a single nonprofit that was supported, solely supported and controlled solely by North Mondale. And I took copious notes, and as a result of taking copious notes from Mike Mosher, yes, Mike is the best in the business here in Illinois, I was able to learn the process to the point where, not only was Mike Mosher able to get us through with no questions asked from the federal government, which is rare, but I was able to do that myself because I was paying attention to the lessons that he shared with us as he was doing the paperwork.
And you also have credentials as a fiscal analyst. Mm-hmm. How did that come about?
Yeah, well, I have an MBA in finance from Northwestern, and I've worked with banks. I've worked with Mount Sinai Hospital, helping them to do a $107 million financing for a new emergency room and obstetrics unit. So my background is in finance, and I've had some experience in real estate development as well before I started running my own nonprofit, and now I'm running a consulting firm and nonprofit Utopia.
And how I got to know Valerie was that she spearheaded the actual citizen-oriented North Lawndale Community Plan in 2016. And without Valerie's leadership, it would not have been so citizen-oriented. So this brings me to a question I've had, is that you're a consultant, that's your business, but you also have a nonprofit, which is Nonprofit Utopia. So if you could explain how you work, that might be educational for other people who want to do the same thing. Like, for example, me, like I'm just an individual, a profit-making individual in the arts, but I have a fiscal sponsor, which is an arts organization whose purpose is to help artists. So that's how I do my nonprofit fundraising. So how do you do yours?
Okay, and just a point of clarification, Nonprofit Utopia is a for-profit. It's an LLC.
Okay.
But I am using the knowledge that I gained running nonprofits and doing community organizing to help other nonprofit organizations. But in answer to your question, if you are working as a for-profit, there are a number of ways that you can do it. One is, like you said, work with a fiscal sponsor. Another is to be on a board and actually work within that nonprofit to, affect the change that you'd like to see. And another way to go about it, if you are one who has you're mission focused, right? But you want to make a profit, you can do a social enterprise. That way you can kind of blend your need to help the community through a for-profit venture. And I would consider, even though I'm not structured as a social enterprise, I would still consider.
Is there a structure for a social enterprise? What is that?
Yeah, there is the L3C, I think. Yeah, so it's a low
profit.
Yeah.
And that's in Illinois, right?
It's in Illinois and a few other states. Illinois was the first to get
and
that.
And then there's a term called B Corp, right?
Yeah, B Corp. That's actually a designation. That's not in your actual structure, but the L3C is an actual legal structure where it's a low profit corporation. B Corp, anybody can be a B Corp. You just have to make sure that you go through, there's certain criteria that you go through, and then you get a certification, but it doesn't impact your legal structure at all.
So that kind of gives you a choice. If you want to make money and you don't want to have all these burdensome requirements of a nonprofit, there's sort of a middle ground.
That's correct.
And if you want to be a nonprofit, what do you think the characteristics of people are who want to be not really genuine nonprofits?
That's interesting. People who are mission focused, people who are not necessarily looking to get rich off of the work that they do. Wow, it's hard to really say. I can say what my idea is, and I can say sometimes that doesn't always follow through. Because there are people who work in nonprofit who are just as cutthroat as people in for-profit, but in a theoretical sense, I find, and in reality, I do find that most people in nonprofit are very mission-oriented, and they really do have a genuine love and concern, for the community. But we should also realize that just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean that you are not competitive, doesn't mean that you're not necessarily business-minded, and you don't have the same motivations. And sometimes the competition is stiffer because there's very little money to be had. Your compensation, so to speak, comes in terms of recognition, being a spokesman for a certain sector or whatever. So there's different competition, different motivation for entering one sector versus the other.
Do you think the atmosphere to get grants and things has changed lately in the last 5 to 10 years? The qualification, especially with the Trump tax thing, that donors have trouble taking the tax deduction now.
Your question, I think, is twofold, or maybe threefold. The first part of your question is, has the environment changed? And then the second part is, has the new tax law had any impact? Is that what I'm getting? And I think the environment has changed in the past 5 to 10 years, especially here in the state of Illinois, whereas the government has subsidized heavily the nonprofit sector. In fact, the state of Illinois, is our largest contributor to the nonprofit sector, but we are just coming off a situation where we had a Governor Rauner, who, his first month or so in office, he unilaterally cut off a number of contracts for nonprofit organizations. He cut budgets that impacted nonprofit organizations, and as a result, the burden was shifted from the public sector to foundations, and the foundations were willing to carry some of the load, but obviously they can't do it all. And their first priority is with organizations with whom they already have some sort of relationship. So if you didn't have an existing relationship with foundations, you were really up a creek without a paddle if you lost your state funding. And we're finding here nationally, with the shutdown, that we're having a similar reaction nationally, whereas some of the funding was cut off, just temporarily, while the government was closed, and and some agencies had to go to foundations in order to get their funding. So that put a little strain on the foundations. It took some of the burden off the off the federal government, but it also put a strain on those nonprofits who rely heavily on federal funds. But thank God the shutdown is over, but that's only for 3 weeks. Who knows what will happen.
Well, what about that tax law about donors to nonprofits not being able to take deductions?
Right. The standard deduction has risen, I believe, to about $15,000. So the average person is not going to make $15,000 in donations. So a number of people who are driven by the tax law who would itemize, they would no longer itemize, and they probably, if their only reason for donating to nonprofits is to get a tax write-off, they probably would have less of an incentive. And then, from what I'm reading, it's starting to have an impact on nonprofits. They're starting to feel it. So what the implications are for nonprofits is they're going to have to be more entrepreneurial, so to speak. They will definitely have to find new ways of gaining income, probably through the social enterprise, where they're developing businesses and generating revenue other than grant revenue to sustain themselves.
Thank you, Valerie. What are some of your upcoming workshops? This is Valerie Leonard of nonprofit Utopia, and she's going to be giving some workshops available to you online and in person. What are these coming up?
Okay, the first one coming up is going to be in conjunction with the Polsky Center at University of Chicago. That is the 29th. That's next week. That goes from 10 o'clock to 12:30. We'll have an overview of the census. Thank God the government is reopening, because had the government not reopened, we would not be having that workshop next week. So we're going to talk about the census and how to generate your own data sets to do economic analysis as well as analysis of the demographics. And again, that's Tuesday at the Polsky Center from 10 o'clock until 12:30 on February.
And where is that? What's the address?
The address is 1453 East 53rd Street. I'm sorry, 1452 East 53rd Street on the second floor. And you can go to nonprofitutopia.com and go under events, and you'll see it, and you can register there. And then on the 12th of February, we'll be doing a webinar, If Your 990 Could Talk. And I think that's going to be a very informative webinar. What we'll do is we'll show people how to read the Form 990 and how to put themselves in the best light so that they can use their 990 to not only report their financial performance, but also talk about some of their achievements, and then begin to use the 990 for marketing purposes and to set themselves apart from the competition.
Well, Valerie Leonard, this has been a really informative talk, and a really privileged to interview you. This is Beryl House-Bonney, and we're live from the Hope Cafe at Roosevelt and Western in Chicago on a very cold Saturday morning.
This is Chicago.
This is the Windy City, and this is the nonprofit queen, Valerie Leonard. Signing off?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much, Bonnie.
Signing off, signing off.
How about holding the button down? Does that work?
It's still not signed.
Let me try. Oh.